Hello everyone, and today we're going to go over Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 4, The Dreyfus Affair. So what is the Dreyfus Affair and why is it important? Well, Arendt thinks this historical event was actually a precursor to Nazism. It led to the largest anti-Semitic political campaign only next to Germany, and it happened in France, where Arendt thinks that anti-Semitism was even more powerful than it was in Germany. The only reason why France didn't turn into a totalitarian regime is because they had a nationalistic pride that Germany lacked. Now, as we talked in the second chapter, anti-Semitism usually arises when the society has an issue with the state, and they see the state basically in cahoots with the Jewish people. So this is going to be no different. The Dreyfus Affair has everything to do with society and the state. So in this chapter, Arendt goes over the historical details of the Dreyfus Affair, and we'll do that right now. In 1894, there was a very secret document that was leaked to the German military. It was held French military secrets, and the document was called the Bordereau. Now, this is a really big crime because France had just ended the war with Germany, the Franco-Prussian War. The French military concluded that there was a spy in their midst, and they needed to find this spy who's giving secrets to the German military. They couldn't find anyone, but who fits the characteristics of someone who's treason and always looking out for themselves? Well, a Jew, of course, and that was Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus was a French military officer who was condemned and convicted of writing the Bordereau. It was testified that the Bordereau was written in his handwriting, but some experts disagreed. And he was just about to get off the hook until someone came up with a theory that the reason why the handwriting in the Bordereau didn't match Dreyfus's handwriting was because Dreyfus was forging his own handwriting. Pretty weird, huh? So Dreyfus was convicted by the army and he was sentenced to a lifelong deportation to Devil's Island. The evidence against Dreyfus was very weak. It was this single document, the Bordereau, which wasn't even in his handwriting, yet the army still wanted to condemn Dreyfus. Now, the spy was still in their midst, so some officers were still, despite being anti-Semitic, wanted to find the spy who's giving German secrets. In 1896, Colonel Picquart of the French military became the intelligence officer, and he decided to investigate the matter a little bit further. What he found is that Dreyfus was innocent, and the letter was actually forged by who he thinks was an officer called Esterhazy. Despite his findings, the army wouldn't have any of it, and they actually deported Picquart to a station in Tunisia. The army's negligence about the issue and their anti-Semitism reached the crowd, and that sparked Émile Zola, an eminent novelist, to write a famous article called J'accuse. Almost 300,000 copies of this were disseminated in the newspaper. J'accuse translates to I accuse, and in this article, he accuses the government of anti-Semitism and nationalistic pride over equality and the Jacobean concept of liberty and freedom. It is a crime to poison the minds of the meek and the humble, to stoke the passions of reactionism and intolerance, by appealing to that odious anti-Semitism that unchecked will destroy the freedom-loving France of the rights of man. It is a crime to exploit patriotism in the service of hatred, and it is finally a crime to ensconce the sword as the modern god, whereas all science is toiling to achieve the coming era of truth and justice. Later that year, Officer Esterhazy, who was originally thought to have forged the handwriting of Dreyfus in the Bordereau, was found to embezzle money, and he was dishonorably discharged from the military. Esterhazy almost immediately went to the local newspaper and confessed that he actually forged the Bordereau document. You can only imagine that this new information caused a stir in the community. And just a few days later, another French officer also confessed to doing forgeries. He was sentenced to jail, but even before he got to jail, he committed suicide. Just to get an idea of the degree of anti-Semitism at this time, Colonel Henry, the man who committed suicide for the forgeries, instead of being seen as someone who is guilty and a criminal, was actually given donations and was praised as a martyr of the anti-Semitism movement. With this new evidence, a retrial had begun in 1899 in Rennes. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island, and he sat in a closed-door trial once again. This time, he was still convicted guilty, despite all the evidence for him. And this led for another sentencing, not lifelong, but 10 years in jail. At this point, the case was not a national issue anymore. It was an international issue, and people from all over the world was condemning France for their basically ineptitude for handling this case. This antagonism towards the French government made the French president worry because they were planning on having the Paris exhibition in 1900, and he was afraid that other countries would boycott the exposition just because of this one case. As a result, the French president offered Dreyfus a pardon only if Dreyfus confessed. Dreyfus confessed, but he also said that he would continue to pursue innocence in the future. After the Paris exhibition, there was a motion for another retrial, but it was largely defeated. Again, in 1903, Dreyfus asked for another revision, and that was put down. It wasn't until 1906 when Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France now at that time, who supported Dreyfus through all of the affair, decided to hear the case. The Court of Appeals heard the case and acquitted Dreyfus of all the charges. However, it was later found out that the Court of Appeals did not have the authority to acquit Dreyfus, and so it still left whether Dreyfus was innocent or guilty in ambiguity. Arendt says it's important to distinguish between what the Dreyfus case is versus the Dreyfus affair. What the Dreyfus case is the legal proceedings that happened mostly in the 19th century. The Dreyfus affair, on the other side, was more of a 20th century phenomenon, and it had to do with anti-Semitic propaganda between the Dreyfusards who supported Dreyfus and the anti-Dreyfusards who were nationalistic, anti-Semitic, mostly influenced by the army and the church, and we'll get into this a little bit more later. Even though the case ended and he was acquitted in 1906, still there were stirrings that happened later in the century. In 1924, the Précis de l'affaire Dreyfus was published by anti-Dreyfusards. This was actually published before, but it was republished, and what it did is recount the events in a very anti-Semitic tone. It conveyed facts that were not true, like the Jews forcing Esterhazy to confess his guilt. It also propounded the conspiracy theory that Jews were trying to take over the world. During these interrogations, Dreyfus had all his cool. He was master of himself, discussed, reasoned, answered, and with astonishing memory for detail. Sometimes he engaged in emphatic demonstrations, crying out to the officer of judicial police, "A race will avenge on yours." In 1931, there was a play called L'Affaire Dreyfus, and in the stands during the play, there were stink bombs that were thrown, there were quarrels that happened in the audience, and the play had to be suspended. Note this is like almost 30 years after the case happened. According to Arendt, the Dreyfus case revealed two growing trends. One was the hatred of Jews, and the other was the suspicion in the Third Republic. But these trends didn't start with the Dreyfus case. In order to understand their origins, we have to go back to the Panama scandal that happened 20 years prior. France took on the project of building the Panama Canal, and in order to do this, they had to take out a billion francs in loans. A lot of money, and they did this through private loans. They raised money from the French public, but the progress was quite slim, and the project turned out to be a complete failure. This left half a million Frenchmen in ruination. The Panama Company, which led the project, became bankrupt, but they didn't want to confess their bankruptcy. So instead of being public about it, they tried to raise more loans, and they did this through bribery. They bribed the parliament, they bribed the officers of the military, they bribed the press, there was lots of bribes. Thus, the very thing which had originally inspired public confidence in the enterprise, namely Parliament's backing of the loans, proved in the end the fact which converted a not-too-sound private business into a colossal racket. Renac, a Jew, held a position which worked with the political parties in Parliament. While he didn't accept any bribes himself, he enabled the flow of bribes. He basically executed the bribes. And later, when he was found out, he committed suicide, and Right before he committed suicide, he gave all of the names of those in Parliament who accepted bribes to a local newspaper and to Eduardo Drummond, one of the most notorious anti-Semites in France at the time. Drummond founded the League Anti-Semite and also labeled himself as the Pope of the anti-Semites. When he acquired the names in Parliament that had accepted bribes, he weekly published some of the names. This left Parliament basically very concerned. According to Arendt, the paper became one of the most influential papers overnight. You could also imagine how Drummond could push his motivation for anti-Semitism by publishing certain names. According to Arendt, the Panama scandal revealed two things. First, that the members of Parliament have become businessmen. The trust in the Republic was waning, and the statesmen were basically elected not to be in the function of a statesman, but to hold special interests for the people. The second revelation is that the intermediaries between the state and business were Jews. While the Jews weren't in Parliament and accepting bribes, they basically situated themselves with political parties and acted as a financier to enable the transactions. Now in chapter 2, we already discussed how the Jews were in relationship with the state, so how does this differ? Well, in chapter 2, in the 18th and 19th centuries, what we discussed is that the Jews acted as bankers for the monarchy. They basically provided a state credit, which built and made the government productive. This led to the development of the nation state and as well as the independent civil service. But now the Jews with the political parties, when they financed these projects, they weren't actually building anything productive. They were just enabling shady transactions. The shady transactions of Reinach and his confederates did not even lead to permanent riches. All they did was shroud in even deeper darkness the mysterious and scandalous relations between business and politics. The Jews were the perfect scapegoat. Someone had to be responsible for these corruption that was happening in the government, and the Jews were already known stereotypically as people who enabled corruption and always worked for themselves through their relations with the society as being bankers and basically not working, but only giving out loans and making sure that they get their money back. The corruption being blamed on the Jews was going to happen. The anti-Semites could at once point to the Jewish parasites on a corrupt society in order to prove that all Jews everywhere were nothing but termites in an otherwise healthy body of the people. It didn't matter where the corruption originated. All that mattered is that the corruption can be put in responsible for a single group of people, and that was the Jews. This was the anti-Semitic spirit that was ripe during the Dreyfus case. So you can only imagine that the army could benefit by this, by basically playing and entertaining the anti-Semitic sentiments of society already. You had two different groups that were competing here. First, the national, aristocratic, backed by the church and backed by the army, anti-Semites who believed the Jews were a foreign body that need to be exposed of. The other group is the Republic, and the Third Republic, the state. The other group represented the Republican attitude and was benefiting with the Third Republic. They tried to extend the original concepts of the French Revolution, where everyone is equal. Basically, an infringement on one is an infringement on all. So who were these anti-Semites anyway? There wasn't just one group, it was widespread amongst multiple groups. The first group is the French army. Now, the French army was not connected with the state at all. If they were connected with anything, they were more connected with the previous Second Republic. And they basically prided themselves as being distinct and nationalistic. Whereas the Republic purported equality and justice for all, the military prided itself on nationality. According to Arendt, the army was basically a caste system that was built up from the Second Republic. But since it was dissociated with the state, it didn't represent the people in a political way. The way it got around this is that it basically partnered with the church, who also represented the people. Many people who thought that the Republic in its democratic ways was basically a disorganized mess and didn't believe in the Republic's ability to govern went to the church because the church had been a stable hierarchical system for a long time. But the church was highly anti-Semitic at this time, and this was due to its influence with the Jesuits. The Jesuits made most of the Catholic policy at this time. The Jesuits were so anti-Semitic that in order to be a novice within their group, you had to prove to them that you had no Jewish blood 4 generations back. In its propaganda paper, the Jesuits said that their goal was to basically remove Jews from all of Europe, from France, Austria, Germany, Italy. Catholic politicians were among the first to realize that latter-day power politics must be based on the interplay of colonial ambitions. They therefore were the first link to anti-Semitism to imperialism, declaring that the Jews were agents of England and thereby identifying antagonism toward them with Anglophobia. Now, when the Jews were assimilated into society, they were actually able to find a way to be with society. There was discrimination, but there was a way to be with it. This was not the case with the army. When the Jews began seeking equality in the army, they came face to face with the determined opposition of the Jesuits, who were not prepared to tolerate the existence of officers immune to the influence of the confessional. The army, highly influenced by the Jesuits and the church, pitted themselves against the Jews. They thought of the Jews basically trying to reveal secret Judah within Europe, trying to take over Europe for themselves. This is nothing but the case. But since they thought that they needed to be the opposite to contra that power. So they saw themselves at war with the Jews. So there's anti-Semitism with the church, with the army, but who else? And Arendt goes into a full section about this idea that she calls the mob. It was only when Clemenceau started publishing Dreyfusard papers in the paper, as well as publishing Émile Zola's J'accuse, that anti-Semitic riots started out on the streets. This mob took to the streets from the army all the way to the anti-Semitic paper, Le Libre Parole, the one that was publishing names of those who had accepted bribes in Parliament. Quoting about Le Libre Parole, through its articles or the personal intervention of its editors, mobilized students, monarchists, adventurers, and plain gangsters, and pushed them into the streets. So what is this mob? Arendt explicitly identifies the mob as, quote, the residue of all the classes. The mob felt like they were left out of society, they were left out of parliament, and thus their instincts were to basically unify around the hatred of feeling left out. According to Arendt, there's a fundamental error about equating what the mob is and what the people are. The people represents the nation, but the mob only represents those who are loud and yelling. Arendt thinks it's easy to confuse the two because both represent all stratas of society. The more the corruption was exposed in the paper, the more the riots got louder, and the more that Jews were assailed in the streets. If the mob wanted to hate society, they would always point to how society tolerated the Jews. If they wanted to hate the state, they would always point at the state's influence in protecting the Jewish people. Basically, everything was about the Jews. But the mob's allegiances were fickle. The one who spoke the loudest and the most persuasive was able to gain the power of the mob. In a way, France became a global theater. Cries of "Death to the Jews" rang out across the country, and the mob took on this military-like complexion. Now, there have been mobs in the past, so what makes this new and interesting? According to Arendt, this is new because the mob was specifically organized around political movements, and also the fact that this mob had this concept of hero worship. The leaders saw the mob as a living expression of strength. It was the way in their theories which identified the mob with the people and converted its leaders into national heroes. The mob became a powerful force, and it even started to chip away at the idea of what was authority. The law and what was right became somewhat ambiguous. It was no longer about equality. It is no longer a question whether Dreyfus is innocent or guilty, but only of who will win, the friends of the army or its foes. As soon as the mob began, it gained its own force. Clemenceau describes that the mob became even indifferent to the idea of the affair. They really just self-reinforced themselves around this concept of hatred. But at last, Clemenceau was able to convince Juarez, who led this mob, that they need to get back to their roots about the Jacobean concept of if you infringe on one person's right, then you infringe on everyone's right. Juarez and the mob thus changed its allegiances to not attacking anti-Semites, but attacking the aristocracy. It was against the rich and the clergy, that for the Republic, not for justice and freedom, that the workers finally took to the streets. It was Zola who recognized that the mob wasn't something to be prided about strength. It was the opposite, and it was very scary. Men have been found to resist the most powerful monarchs and to refuse to bow down before them, but few indeed have been found to resist the crowd, to stand up alone before misguided masses, to face their implacable frenzy without weapons and with folded arms, to dare a no when a yes is demanded. So we've talked a lot about who the anti-Semites were. Now, who are the Dreyfusards, the people who supported Dreyfus in all of this? According to Arendt, the Dreyfusards, or those who supported Dreyfus, were a diverse mixture of a lot of different groups. They were conjured by Emile Zola's writings in the newspaper. Everywhere a minority existed, which took up Clemenceau's plea for justice, and his heterogeneous minority made up the Dreyfusards. Now, what's disturbing is that all of these political battles existed outside of Parliament. You had the anti-Semites who used their political movement by raiding the streets, and you had the Dreyfusards who used their political power through the press. All of this was done outside of the Parliament. In a way, Parliament was losing grasp of the mood of its country. So again, what does this all mean? Going back to Arendt's original point, the Dreyfus affair basically showed that there were two increasing trends happening. One was anti-Semitism, and the other was basically suspicion or lack of trust in the new republic. Both these trends would continue into the 20th century and would eventually lead to the rise of Nazism. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. In the next part, we're going to go over chapter 5, which is the start of the section in the book called Imperialism. Thank you.